Hi everyone, welcome back. Last class period we talked about the failures of the first government of the United States, based as it was on the Articles of Confederation. And today we need to see how experiment number 2 in a national government, the Constitution, will shake out. And what you need to understand is during the Constitutional Convention there was no consensus among states, either large states, those that had a large population, or small states, those that had a much smaller head count. No consensus among them, and in fact if you take a look at the two most popular plans that were aired out and discussed extensively during the Constitutional Convention, you'll see that the Virginia plan, for example here on the left, was favored by the states with larger populations. The main reason being is one of the key differences between the two plans is the Virginia plan calls for a bicameral, which is a two-house legislature in which both houses would be elected proportionally. And what that means is that it would be your population. So if you are a larger state like Virginia or New York during this time period, you would simply get more representatives. Your states would have more of a say than states like Rhode Island, for example, or Delaware during this period. The smaller states favored the New Jersey plan put forth by William Patterson, and it had called for just a one house in the legislative branch in which all states, if you'll notice, would have the same power. Each one would have one vote in this national legislature. This is obviously preferential for the smaller states. They don't want to have their voices drowned out by the bigger states. They want the exact same vote count as their larger neighbors. Essentially, though, both the Virginia and the New Jersey plan, aside from the differences in the legislative branch, call for some of the same things. As you can see, both plans call for three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. And they also call for this new national government to have far more authority than the national government as created under the Articles of Confederation. For example, the Virginia plan wanted the legislature to be able to regulate trade. They wanted the judicial branch to be able to strike down laws that were unconstitutional, and for the federal government to be able to use armed force if need be. The New Jersey plan also called for similarly greater powers for the national government, a national government that could now lay and levy taxes and collect taxes, regulate trade, that sounds familiar, and that state laws would be subordinate, that is to say beneath, laws passed by the national government, thus creating a federal system. So of these two plans, which one gets adopted? Well, actually, they both do. We end up seeing compromise between both sides over what this new government should look like. All right, and to begin, both sides easily agreed that there needed to be, the concept of a separation of powers. We're going to see several different branches of government being created. The legislative branch, as you can see here on the slide, is Congress, which is a blanket term for this bicameral. It's two houses. It's the House of Representatives and it's the Senate, this bicameral legislature. And their job is to draft laws. Now, when it comes to who gets a vote, how many votes does each state get, essentially you also see both the those who favor the New Jersey plan and those who favor the Virginia plan having to give up a little bit. The House of Representatives is elected proportionally. That appeased the larger states, those with bigger populations, meaning that, for example, today, California, one of the most heavily populated states, gets way more representatives in the House of Representatives than a much smaller and more sparsely settled state, such as Delaware or Rhode Island. But to appease the smaller states who didn't want their voices getting drowned out, the second house of the legislature, the Senate, is one in which there's equal representation. Each state gets the exact same number of senators. And then when we look at another branch of this new federal government as it's created, we look at the executive branch, that is the president, the vice president's cabinet. The executive branch, their job is to execute the law, meaning to carry it out. They don't pass laws. That's only Congress that does that. But once the law has been passed, they are charged with making sure that it gets executed correctly. And then finally, the third branch is the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court and many other federal courts. They are the ones who evaluate the law. They review the laws that have been passed by Congress to make sure that those laws actually uphold the rights of American citizens rather than infringing upon those rights. And so when we think about these three branches of government, what we've essentially been talking about is the concept of a separation of powers, that each particular branch in the government alone, by itself, has certain duties that no other branch can carry forth with. And this is to prevent one branch of government from accruing too much power over time and maybe kind of running away with the entire show. Each branch has to work with another branch to make sure that laws are passed, enforced, reviewed, upheld, or struck down. And then another way, the so-called Founding Fathers sort of created a constitution in which they wanted to make sure no one branch got too powerful, was through the concept of checks and balances, where each branch of government has certain powers over another branch, but at the same time, that branch also is subject to the powers of another branch. So I'll give you some examples of what I mean. When the president gets the opportunity to nominate someone to sit on the Supreme Court, that's a lifelong appointment to the judicial branch. While the president might be able to suggest and nominate people to sit on the highest court of the land, there is an intermediate step, and that intermediate step is those nominees that the president has put forward have to then be vetted by Congress. All right, so then the legislative branch gets to kind of step in and say yes or no whether or not the president's nominees for the court can move forward in this case. Another sort of check and balance is Congress can draft laws, but the president, the executive branch, can also veto laws, which is to say strike down laws, and send them back to Congress. So we have a number of ways in which these various parts of the government hopefully will sort of balance one another out over time, and that they are sort of forced to work with one another and to ultimately make sure that the country functions smoothly. Now, one area of compromise, one very controversial topic that you can bet was discussed at the Constitutional Convention, was the subject of slavery here in the United States. The Constitution doesn't even really mention slavery by name. It kind of alludes to it in the Fugitive Slave Clause, whereby those persons, quote, held to service or labor, unquote, who fled to other states, that they had to be returned to their original owners. But that's really about as close as the Constitution gets to slavery. The reason being is that if you'll recall, I mentioned immediately after the American Revolution, actually starting during the Revolution, with a few states, you're starting to see in the North slavery being outlawed. Whereas for the southern states, their economy is so very intertwined with the institution of slavery, they will never let go of that institution. And in fact, it will take a civil war, as we'll see, to force them to let go of that institution. So essentially, both sides, the northern states and the southern states, kind of understood that if either one of them wanted to have any hope of coming together to sign the same document to create a unified central government, that they kind of had to just put slavery off the table. So it's rather swept under the rug. That being said, we will see that the southern states are going to demand that their slave population be counted for the purposes of representation to Congress. The northern states, however, felt that this was unfair, that the slave population in the South were not considered to be citizens. They certainly had no rights as citizens, nor could they vote. So from the standpoint of the northern states, again, who have been phasing out slavery, they see this as just simply unfair, and they're worried that as slavery grows in the southern states, that eventually the southern states might just very well drown out their voices in the House of Representatives. So I put up here a reminder that when we talked about the legislative branch and how it was created, it ended up being a bicameral legislature where each state got equal representation in the Senate, but that the House of Representatives, was based upon population. So that's where this issue around the Three-Fifths Compromise comes from. Eventually, a bizarre, totally random fraction was decided upon between the northern and southern states. The northern states fought for
no representation for Southern slaves, but Southern states insisted. So they decided that 3/5 of the South's enslaved population could be counted for the purposes of determining extra representation in the House of Representatives in Congress. This issue is not going away, though. In fact, the debate between the northern and southern states is going to deepen over time and become incredibly antagonistic all over the issue of slavery and its movement westward. In fact, as James Madison, himself a slaveholder, observed of the discussions between northern and southern states at the convention over this issue, he said, quote, "It seemed now to be pretty well understood that the real difference of interest lay not between the large and the small states, but between the North and the South." Now, we also need to talk about the Bill of Rights, which will be a series of 10 amendments to the Constitution. These are going to be tacked on to the end. Okay, the document was pretty much complete. A couple of states, Rhode Island and North Carolina, said, well, this is nice that we've spent all this time and spilt all this ink enumerating what powers our federal government will have. But what about your average citizen underneath this new set of laws? What essential rights do they have that no government can ever take away from them? All right, so this is the genesis of the Bill of Rights, which will end up being, as I said, the first 10 additions or amendments to the Constitution. And these are important not just because they protect the basic rights of all citizens, but because they sort of set the stage for future amendments. The simple fact that you have these 10 additions kind of paves the way for a document which is a living Constitution, which is to say one that can change over time with the needs of a changing population, the needs of changing geography or, social or political movements. It created the idea that perhaps the Constitution shouldn't be fixed for all time, but that perhaps it can be added to over time. Now, I wanted to say something as well. We're going to see the genesis of the two-party political system emerging from the debate that was going on between those who were advocates of a strong central government, meaning the Federalists, and another faction that were kind of suspicious of giving too much power to the federal government and wanted the states to have the lion's share of power. And so those became known as the Anti-Federalists. And so the first two political parties in the United States, those parties who will be fielding candidates for office that reflect these very different philosophies, will be the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party that will be espousing anti-federalist views. George Washington, of course, will be the first commander-in-chief of this nation under the Constitution. He had been commander of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War and, of course, had earned a tremendous amount of respect and gratitude on the part of the American public as a result. Not to say he wasn't going to have to still reassure people that he wasn't going to actually try to turn this new position of president into a monarchy. He had a lot of reassuring to do on that point. He also had to worry about financial problems in this new nation. Tremendously high war debts were racked up fighting the British all those years. And so he will appoint a fellow Federalist politician by the name of Alexander Hamilton to serve as his first Secretary of the Treasury. One of Hamilton's ideas to try and raise revenue to pay off the tremendous war debts that the nation and the states owed was to place a tax on whiskey, one of the most popularly produced and consumed alcoholic beverages in the former colonies at this point in time. However, we're going to see a group of farmers in western Pennsylvania getting upset over this new tax. They considered it not only a financial burden, but some of them are going to say, we didn't agree to this tax, therefore we shouldn't have to pay it. They're going to trot out those old Revolutionary War slogans like no taxation without representation. This despite the fact that it will be their elected representatives that will pass or help to implement this tax. So we're going to see that Washington is going to have to kind of, he knows everyone's watching his response here during this armed rebellion. He knows he's going to have to make a swift and pretty decisive action against this. He will dispatch nearly 13,000 militiamen to quell the revolt, and several people will be hanged for treason for rising up against the U.S. government.
Now, let me add very quickly that Washington is also having trouble with France and Great Britain, who now are at war with one another by his second term as president in office. Each of these powers wants the United States to help them out. We have no money, we have no military. So Washington says thanks, but no thanks. This will anger both of these countries and lead to problems with foreign policy down the road.